Imagine you wake up 12,000 years ago. The world is freezing, and your fire died. You are shivering, and you have not eaten. Your stomach is empty. Your hands are shaking. And in your hand, you hold something small, a few wild seeds gathered from the grass. Eat them now, and you survive one day. Bury them in the dirt, and you starve. Nobody in history has ever done this before, and nobody is here to teach you how. Yet you push them into the cold ground. It may be the worst idea ever had. Scientists call it humanity's single greatest mistake. But that buried seed will grow anyway, and it becomes a field of golden grain. That field becomes a village of mud houses. The village hardens into a walled stone town. The town swells into the very first city, and that city becomes every city on Earth. Everything you have ever known grew from this. All of it. One seed and one choice. So how did ancient humans invent farming? And why did it so nearly destroy us? First, forget everything you know about cavemen. For 300,000 years, nobody farmed. Not a single field, not one planted crop. We hunted animals across open plains and forests. We gathered berries, roots, nuts, and wild seeds, and we moved wherever the food happened to be. You lived in a band of 30 people. Everyone was family. Everything was shared equally. You owned only what your arms could carry. When food ran low, you simply walked away. You followed the herds across the changing land. You followed the seasons, year after year. Studies of modern foragers reveal something strange. They worked roughly 4 hours every single day. The rest of their day belonged to them. Talking, resting, telling stories under open sky. Now look at the skeletons they left behind. Foragers stood taller than the farmers who followed. Their bones were denser, their joints lasted longer, and their teeth were very nearly perfect. They had no sugar and no soft grain. Cavities are almost absent from the whole record. Free time, strong bodies, a wide, varied diet. Honestly, a better life than farming ever was. Which makes what happened next make no sense. So why would anyone ever give that up? Because our bodies had one very serious problem. We had no claws to fight or dig, no fangs, no horns, no natural weapons at all. No thick fur, no armor, and no speed. Just soft skin, thin bones, and constant hunger. To most predators, that is fairly accurate. Worse still, we could not digest raw grain. Wild wheat passes straight through the human gut, so every hillside of grass was completely useless. But we carried one weapon nothing else had. Something no other animal on Earth ever possessed. We could watch a plant through one season and correctly predict what would happen next. We could connect a seed to a plant, cause and effect held inside one mind. And crucially, we could teach it to others. Knowledge that outlived the person who found it. Then we learned to grind grain into flour, and we learned to cook that flour over fire. Cooking unlocked food our bodies could not use. Hard, useless seeds became an actual meal. In one step, grass had turned into food. And there was an enormous amount of grass. But the world was still locked in ice. It was cold, dry, and violently unpredictable. Anything you planted would simply die in frost. Farming was not difficult. It was impossible. Then, 11,000 years ago, the ice retreated. The planet warmed, and the great glaciers melted. Rain returned to land that was frozen desert. And across the world, everything slowly turned green. In one particular curve of land, dramatically so. Historians call that region the Fertile Crescent. It covers modern Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, stretching down through Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. And it filled with wild wheat and barley. Not a few plants, entire oceans of grain. For a while, that is what it was. Why chase a deer through miles of forest when food is growing within arm's reach? So the wanderers gradually began slowing right down. They built simple camps beside the richest fields, and then they stayed, season after season. That single choice, to stay, changed everything. Because the moment you stop moving, you accumulate. Baskets, stores, things you cannot carry away. Now here is the part that surprises everyone. Nobody ever sat down and invented farming. There was no genius, there was no moment. It crept in across many human lifetimes. Nobody alive ever noticed it was happening. And it may well have started right here, at the rubbish heap, beside the campfire. Worse than that, it was also the toilet. On every trip home, seeds spilled from bundles. They landed in the waste beside the huts, exactly where the soil was darkest and richest. All winter, nothing happened. The ground stayed bare. Then in spring, food grew from the rubbish. Imagine being the first person ever to notice, to stand there, staring, and slowly understand. Food grows wherever we happen to drop seeds, the most valuable thought any human ever had. So they began dropping seeds deliberately, on purpose, choosing the ground and scattering grain across it, clearing away the weeds, roots, and loose stones, spreading grain evenly over the open, broken soil. Then walking away and getting on with living, and returning months later to see what happened. The food was there, quietly waiting for them, without ever understanding what they had just done. But this strange new power came at a price. Because now, somebody had to pull the weeds. Somebody had to guard it from hungry birds. Somebody had to carry water through the summer. Somebody had to sleep beside it every night. Slowly, the field began to own the farmer. That is a better question than you realize. Somewhere in there, a line had been crossed, without ceremony and without anybody ever noticing it. And when they looked back, it had gone. The first true farm had quietly come into existence. 300,000 years of wandering had ended. Wild open land had become owned, measured land. Land that you could stand on and claim. Land that two neighbors could argue bitterly over. Land that families would eventually fight and die for. And grain that could be stored through winter. Which also meant grain somebody else could steal. You are running slightly ahead of me, yes, because before the crime came something stranger. Ancient humans had started playing God with life. Look closely at any wild field of grain. Wild wheat shatters the moment it fully ripens. It throws its seeds violently into the wind. Excellent for the plant, spreading itself far away, useless for a human trying to gather it. But a few rare plants held their seeds, and a few others grew much bigger grains. Those were the ones easiest to collect, so those were the ones carried home nightly, and those were the seeds that got replanted. Season after season, that small choice repeated. 100 years, then 500, then 1,000. And slowly, the plant itself began to change. Thin, wild grass thickened into heavy, golden wheat. They had created something that never existed before. A plant that cannot scatter its own seed. Modern wheat now depends on humans to survive. We rebuilt a living species to serve us, with absolutely no idea what a gene was. Selective breeding, thousands of years too early. No laboratory, no theory, just habit, endlessly repeated. And it happened to 8 crops at once: emmer wheat, einkorn wheat, and tough field barley, then lentils, then garden peas, then the chickpea, bitter vetch for animals, flax for rope, cloth. Those 8 crops built the entire Western world. And then we turned toward the animals. It began with something watching from the darkness. A wolf, sitting just beyond the firelight, drawn by the bones and scraps we discarded. The calmer ones were tolerated and quietly fed. The aggressive ones were driven away or killed. Generation after generation, the calm ones came closer. And across thousands of years, the wolf changed. The dog became our partner before agriculture existed. Next came the wild goats and mountain sheep. Instead of hunting them across the hills, we gathered them together and kept them close. We penned them and guarded them from predators, and took their milk, their wool, their meat. A living food store that refilled itself constantly. Then we looked at the enormous wild aurochs, wild cattle standing 2 meters at the shoulder, animals capable of killing a person instantly. Somebody said exactly that, and then they did. Bred smaller, bred calmer, bred over many centuries, until they became the cattle we know today. Then the pigs arrived, drawn by our waste, and with that, the farm was finally complete. But now we lived pressed against our animals, and that decision would cost us almost everything. Because farming did have one enormous advantage. It produced more food from the same land. In some cases, 10 times more per acre. And more food meant more children being born. And crucially, far more of them survived. A wandering mother can carry only one infant. A settled mother faces no such hard limit. So the human population began climbing sharply. 30 people became 300 within generations, and 300 became several thousand afterwards. Small villages hardened into permanent crowded towns, and those towns became the very first cities. For the first time, you lived among strangers, people whose names you would never actually learn. And that changes everything about how humans live. You now owned things genuinely worth stealing. You argued over boundaries, water, and grain. Human waste piled up in the narrow streets, hundreds of bodies pressed together day after day. From outside, all of this looked like progress. It was not progress. It was something darker. Because here is what almost nobody tells you. Farming did not make human life any better. In almost every measurable way, it got worse. Compare the two sets of skeletons directly. The forager stood tall, upright, and strong. The farmer was shorter, hunched, and visibly worn. Average human height dropped across the entire world. Their lower spines compressed and began collapsing, from grinding grain on stone, hour after hour. Their knee joints wore down and turned arthritic. Their toe bones deformed from constant, endless kneeling. And the damage is always worse in women, because grinding grain was largely their daily work. Foragers had worked roughly 4 hours a day. Farmers worked from first light until full dark. Their teeth began rotting inside their own skulls. Soft, starchy grain destroys tooth enamel completely, and their diet collapsed to almost nothing. Dozens of wild foods became 3 farmed crops, and in bad years, sometimes only 1. Malnutrition appears clearly in the bone record, and when a harvest failed, as harvests do, there was no herd left to follow anywhere. There was only famine inside a trapped village, and that famine returned again and again. Child mortality rose sharply in farming settlements. Farmers died younger than the foragers before them. They worked far harder than their own ancestors. They ate far worse, and they got sicker. And in the end, they died much sooner. The worst mistake in the history of humanity. And somehow, it got worse than even that, because we now slept beside our own livestock, surrounded by their waste and by our own, hundreds of bodies packed into tight settlements. It was a perfect breeding ground for disease. And diseases began jumping from animals into humans. Influenza came across to us from birds. Measles crossed over from domesticated cattle herds. Smallpox almost certainly came from our livestock. Tuberculosis, anthrax, and a long list beyond. And now we lived close enough to spread them, village to village along the new trade routes, region to region across entire growing continents. Whole settlements were emptied by a single outbreak, plagues that would haunt humanity for millennia, killing more people than every war ever fought. And all of it from one simple thing: choosing to live beside our own food supply. So why on earth did nobody simply stop? They could still see the old life outside, free foragers moving across the distant hills. And they could never reach it again, because of what farming had done to them. They had multiplied beyond what wilderness supports. The wild cannot feed several thousand hungry people. Foraging comfortably supports a band of 30. It has never supported a town of thousands. So they were forced to farm even harder, which produced more food and more surviving children, who then needed even more land under crops. A spiral, tightening slowly, with no way out. Each generation was locked in tighter than before, and that cage did not simply hold them. With every generation, it quietly grew smaller. Their grandparents had possessed a real, live choice. Their grandchildren would never have one, ever. Born already inside a trap they never chose. Humanity had made a trade without ever agreeing. The health and freedom of every individual exchanged for the raw growth of the species. And measured that way, the species absolutely won. It won more completely than anyone could imagine. Because farming produced one genuinely revolutionary thing: a surplus. More food than anybody needed today. Grain that could be sealed away and saved, stored through winter and through the bad years. counted, measured, divided, and argued over carefully. And for the very first time, actually owned. One farmer could now feed many other people, which meant not everybody had to farm anymore. And for the first time in human history, some people had nothing they needed to do. They invented having a job at all, actually. For 300,000 years, everyone did one job: find enough food today and survive until tomorrow. Suddenly, there were real options for the first time. Some became potters, shaping wet clay into vessels. Some became builders, raising walls of mud brick. Some became weavers, working flax into real cloth. Some became healers, learning plants and setting bones. Some became priests, standing between people and gods. Some became soldiers, trained purely to fight others. And a very few of them became kings. Human society split apart into specialized roles, and from that moment, civilization properly caught fire. Writing itself was invented almost immediately afterwards. Not for poetry, and not for telling stories. It was invented purely to count the grain. Our earliest writing really is just accounting records. Marks recording who owned which sacks of barley. Marks recording who still owed what to whom. And from those marks came numbers, then mathematics, then laws to settle the endless bitter disputes. Because strangers living together desperately need agreed rules. Then walls, built to protect the grain inside. Then armies, standing guard over the full granaries. And then armies sent to take somebody else's. The earliest wars were fought over stored food. Whoever controlled the grain now controlled the people. Cities grew together into the first real kingdoms. Kingdoms expanded outward into vast, sprawling empires. Then came roads, long-distance trade, and money. Then temples, pyramids, libraries, and monumental architecture. Then wheels, then worked metal, then machines, then engines, factories, electricity, and industrial cities. And eventually, everything that you see today. Satellites, aircraft, and glass towers touching the clouds. And every single piece of it grew from one small field of ordinary wild grain. Nothing else could ever have built this world. And here is the genuinely eerie part. This did not happen only one single time. In China, along the enormous Yangtze River, people were domesticating wild rice completely independently, roughly 9,000 years ago, entirely alone. And further north, they domesticated millet too. Then cross the entire planet to central Mexico, where a scrawny, useless grass called teosinte grew. Tiny, rock-hard kernels, barely worth eating. Over thousands of years of patient selection, they rebuilt that plant from the ground up, and they turned it into modern corn. The same plant, 10,000 years apart. High in the Andes, they domesticated the potato. In New Guinea, bananas, sugarcane, and taro root. Across Africa, sorghum, pearl millet, and several yams. At least 11 separate places around the world, with absolutely no contact between any of them. No ships, no roads, no messages, no knowledge. The same idea, discovered again and again independently, which means it was never really an accident. Give human beings a warm and stable planet, and we will always, eventually, do exactly this. So come back to that freezing cold morning. Back to that starving human by dead embers. Back to that hand and those few seeds. Back to one small, quiet, unremarkable decision. To bury them in dirt instead of eating. They never once understood what they had done. They believed they were surviving one more winter. In truth, they were building the modern world, every single part of it, without any exception. So that leaves us one final difficult question. Those foragers were measurably healthier than you, freer than we are, and they worked less. But they could never have built any of this. So after 12,000 years of human effort, which of us actually made the better trade? Think about that next time you eat bread. We never really chose any part of this. We stumbled into it and then kept going. Then farming almost certainly saved your life. Next time, we uncover how humans invented laws and why they so desperately needed them. Subscribe now so you do not miss it. I will see you in the next one.